we're getting exposure to PFAS chemicals through food packaging, through, our pizza boxes, our microwave food containers. They're in our drinking water. They're major environmental pollutant. They're referred to as forever chemicals. So though they don't break down, they biopersist in our bodies. They build up. They're hugely problematic. And then we're also being exposed through our drinking water. PFAS is found in firefighting foam. So if you live near an airport, if you live near a military base, military is one of the largest polluters in the world, unfortunately, with various chemicals that they just dump into the groundwater and pollute communities and environments.
I think people are oftentimes very surprised to learn that even though we're in the United States, and yes, we have these federal agencies that are designed to protect consumers, there's not a whole lot of protection going on. So let's kind of start, where from the beginning, like where the scope or the magnitude of the issue really stems from. I know that there's many reasons, but I think it's important for people to understand just from the perspective of what is designed to help us. And then, we need to go beyond what is currently available to be able to look even more closely at things we're exposed to in our personal care products, our environment, and our food.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big misconception that people have, and understandably they have this, is that the federal government has policies in place that are protective, and that products wouldn't be for sale in the marketplace if they weren't safe. Like that's just the general assumption that people have. And certainly there are some checks and balances. Like people can't, we have, I don't know if everybody remembers the famous Tylenol tampering case. I think that was in the early 90s, late 80s or early 90s. And all the Tylenol came off the shelves and, so there's things like that. So I don't want to say that there's no protections, because we do have the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which, they're the ones that do product recalls. If there's a, your jacket toggle is going to get caught in the door of a school bus. I remember that from the 90s. That was 80s or 90s. That was a thing. And so, or, lead paint in Thomas the Tank Engine toys. We do have some recall, but that's coming from just specifically the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and they're handling consumer products. They don't handle things like pesticides, herbicides, those kinds of the sort of more widely used products and chemicals in the marketplace. So I think the first thing to understand is that, in the United States, we have really weak policy that regulates chemicals in commerce. And if you talk to somebody from the chemical industry or manufacturing industry, they'll probably tell you the opposite, that the regulations are too restrictive to do business. But that's just kind of the song that they sing, because they're trying to defend their marketplace and their place in the marketplace, and their ability to sell products and make profit. And so the reality is that we have industry is very heavily involved with government in the writing of the laws that ultimately protect industry over the consumer. And so, it takes us decades to pass legislation that is legislation that's supposed to protect us. So we have the Toxic Substances Control Act, which was first passed in 1976, and it took 40 years, 4 decades, for that policy to get an update, to get a major update, and that happened in 2016. So it took 40 years. And the reason it took so long is because of industry influence and the sort of partisanship that kind of worked its way in. But this is a nonpartisan, at the roots of it, this is a nonpartisan issue. Why? Because all people are exposed, regardless of your political party. And yet it became a very heavily partisan issue. And so, if it's taking us 40 years to pass an update to our primary policy that regulates chemicals in commerce, and not even all chemicals in commerce, just the chemicals that agency oversees or that policy oversees, you can start to see how what's happening in the marketplace isn't, we're not guaranteed safe products. We're not guaranteed to not be harmed by the products that we're encountering. And then certainly another layer into this, and this is an aspect that I just find fascinating and infuriating, is that, people look at the United States as being this very litigious society, right? Like if you don't like us, if you don't like it, sue us, right? And so corporations bank on that mindset, right? That, oh, well, if something is bad and something is harmful, like we'll find out real fast because people will sue us. But I don't know how many people that that have tried to go up against a large multinational billion-dollar company like a SC Johnson or Johnson & Johnson or whatever it is, and win, right? And so companies know that the little guy isn't going to be victorious. They're not going to have the funds to actually go after them. And they rely on that to kind of keep things copacetic for them. And so there's so like, I could probably spend an hour just talking about that kind of dynamic that we're in. But the bottom line is that chemicals are not required to be tested for safety prior to going to market. There are no strict requirements that say that. We have hundreds of thousands of chemicals in circulation globally. The vast majority of those have never been tested for safety, and certainly not the kind of safety testing that is reflective of our actual exposures, right? So there's safety testing data that exists for a small percentage, like 2%, if less, of the chemicals in commerce. And even that data is not necessarily representative of the chronic low levels of exposure that people are experiencing every day.
I think you described it best, this kind of Goldilocks effect, that it's, this cumulative exposure. Like people will say, well, I'm a guy, I just use bar soap, I use shampoo, I brush my teeth, I use deodorant, I use 5 products a day, but it's the cumulative impact of all of those chemicals in each one of those products over time.
Yeah.
And I think for so many of us, we don't think about our skin as being an absorbent organ. We just think, oh, I slather myself.
As an organ.
Exactly.
We don't even think of it as an organ, but technically it is. It's the largest one that we have. And, I think a lot of people will toss out statements like everything you put on your skin is absorbed into your body. And that's certainly not true. Like, there's plenty of products that are designed to sit on the surface of the skin. That's how makeup works, right? There are products that are designed to penetrate the skin. And then there's other, ingredients and products that aren't intended to go into the skin, but they do just because of the, their molecular size. And so, we don't absorb everything, but we do absorb a lot of chemicals and compounds that we put on our skin. And not all of that is bad. But in the cases where it is bad, like we should pay attention to that and we should explore that. And that's really the work that's happening in the, the field of environmental health that is starting to explore, like, what are the repercussions of, these chemicals showing up in people. And I think an interesting thing for people to understand is, like, we can't test chemicals directly on humans. That's not the way it works. There's ethical standards. Like, that's not how science research happens. We do, however, test on animals. And so in this realm where we're in a situation where we can't directly test chemicals and see, like, oh, what would happen if, like, a human being was exposed to this chemical every day for its life for 80 years? What would the impact be? We wouldn't do that ethically. B, nobody's committing to an 80-year longitudinal study, right? Like, that's not happening. And so we do rodent studies. And then we have to draw inferences between animal research and epidemiological data that is looking not for necessarily health effects, but they're looking for levels of chemicals and associations between chemical exposures and certain illnesses or outcomes, both positive and negative. And so we do see that when we look at that animal research and then look at the epidemiological research, we see a lot of parallels, and that gives us the data that we have or the information that we have to say, okay, well, maybe we need to be maybe we need to be approaching things differently in terms of our chemical regulation. But then we go back to the first part of the conversation, which is we're butting up against industry that's pushing really, really, really hard against any movement in that area.
So I'm curious, was there something that occurred for you or a loved one that got you started on with a desire and an interest in this area? Because obviously, a lot of it can be very scientifically dense, as you're diving into this research and diving into especially epidemiological studies. This is not stuff you sit up with, late at night. I mean, you really do
Right.
have to have all your mental faculties aligned to be able to absorb what you're reading. But was there an issue? Did something crop up? Was there a family member who got harmed, or just your genuine interest? I know you describe yourself as a science nerd, which I love,
Yeah.
because I love to understand the why behind the how. But was there one thing in particular that kind of cropped up that developed your interest in this, or you just kind of fell into it?
There wasn't. I think a lot of people in the health space come to their area, their little niche, because either they or a family member had an issue, and I didn't have that. I didn't. I kind of grew up in a teenage 20s culture of like kind of damn the man, and like that whole vibe where like let's stand up for the little guy, let's right some wrongs kind of ethos. And when I started learning about this topic, which really happened kind of accidentally, because as I was working as a health coach, and I had clients. I didn't really have a very clear niche in my health coaching business. So I was just kind of working with people casually, typically around weight loss. That was kind of an easy area. Most of my clients who sought me out for that, they had results, they did all the things. And then I had like a couple of clients who also did all the things, but their weight didn't really budge, and they were frustrated and I was frustrated. And so I started looking at like, what am I missing? There's got to be something I'm missing, because like they clean up their diet, they're drinking the water, they're sleeping, they're doing yoga, they're minimizing their stress, they're whatever it was, like they did all the things that worked for everybody else. And that was really where I kind of cracked the door open into this whole area of environmental health, and like, wait a minute, there's things that we're unknowingly exposed to. They're not things that we're doing, right? It's not choices that we're making, that I'm going to eat this versus that, or I'm going to exercise or not exercise, or whatever. They were just things that we're passively being exposed to, and some people certainly more than others. That in that case of that sort of deep dive into the literature was linked to metabolic issues that led to insulin resistance, diabetes, weight gain, resistant weight loss. And I was like, wait a second. At that point, I'd already been I'd been researching and reading about nutrition and kind of wellness superficially and just for myself, but at that point for like a decade. And so I was like, wait a minute, like, why is this kind of the first time I'm hearing about this? I'd gone to a health coaching school, and for a year-long program, it was not mentioned. None of the practitioners that I spoke to knew anything about this. And so that kind of was unfolding. And then at the same time, my sister-in-law was pregnant with my niece. She's now 12. So that's always my yardstick, for my memoring stick for how long I've been in this space. And I started researching what are the products that, like a baby's a crib mattress. Like, let's start looking at what are the issues. And I was horrified. I was horrified at the chemicals that were being used in products for babies. And then the more that I started digging into just products for everybody, it was really this feeling of, this is not okay. And it's not okay that people don't know about this, and not okay that people aren't actively talking about it, because the secrecy around it is what keeps it being perpetuated. It's what allows companies to get away with knowingly putting carcinogenic chemicals in products, putting chemicals that are known or even suspected to be reproductive toxins and toxic to our most vulnerable, which are infants and babies still in the womb. And so that, like, I just kept thinking, how do these people sleep at night? Like, what is wrong with people that they're so willing to put profits over people? And so it was that outrage, honestly, that really like was the steam that moved this engine along. And I quickly realized that, like I said, all of the health professionals that I spoke to were like, I don't know anything about this, and I feel like I probably should. And so I spent 2 years, really making sure that I understood, like doing all the research, going to all the conferences and lectures and symposiums and talking to scientists and doing all the things that I knew that was in my skill set at the time to really understand this topic so that I could kind of spread the word to health professionals, and that's been happening since 2012. So, and what's great is that this dialogue has expanded so much in that time.
Well, I'm so glad that you had, the circumstances that developed this passion and this interest. And I think there's a lot in what you stated that I want to unpack. There's a degree of cognitive dissonance. And for people that listen to this podcast or other podcasts that I've done or other people's podcasts or read things, sometimes it's very hard to understand that there are individuals in this country, other countries, it's not unique to the United States, that are more interested in profitability over safety. And so that's number one. I think number two, sometimes it's really hard to wrap your head around. So we're not suggesting anyone that's listening that you have to change everything you're doing right away. It could just be one thing if you take one little nugget from this podcast that you're ready to do, one little thing that has a huge impact. And then, number three, I too, I left clinical medicine 5 years ago and developed this business. And almost instantaneously, I started attracting women about the same age that I was that were really struggling with weight loss resistance. And so I always refer to it, the analogy of it's like peeling an onion, that, sometimes people, they remove inflammatory foods, they sleep better, they manage their stress, and boom, the weight comes off. Other people have to do 5 other things. And then there are people who really still are doing all the right things. And I believe everything they're telling me fervently. And we've checked all the labs and we've done stool studies. I mean, we've done all the tests. And it's this type of nuance. It's these exposures to toxins that are oftentimes what most people are not having an honest conversation about. And so that's why I'm so very grateful that you're here today. And what I was thinking might be most helpful for listeners let's focus on, because there's so many things, like I could bring Lara back and talk to her for hours and we will definitely make that happen. But what I thought would be most useful today would be to talk about endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I'd love for you to explain a little bit about what these are, because there are probably some people saying, yeah, I've heard of that, I might recognize, but other people are saying, I've never heard of this before. What are those? And even if you are really careful and conscientious, you are exposed to these things on a daily basis. And so let's unpack what they are and identify examples, and then we can talk about what they actually do, because you were already starting to allude to some of what they do with the hormone disruption.
Yeah.
But I think it's particularly important for women who are, struggling with weight loss resistance in particular, people who are trying to get pregnant, are pregnant, have young children, people that are at my stage of life where I'm done having kiddos who are now teenagers. And, we're focusing on different things. We've got all these hormonal fluctuations, but let's talk about these group of toxins, because I think this is particularly important for the listeners.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably, I would say, one of the biggest and most important areas. And there's so much research on endocrine disruption at this point. Like, there's still lots we have to learn. But there's a lot that we know. So the endocrine system is our hormonal system. It's not just sex and reproduction. It's everything from digestion and whether you're hungry or full. It's your mood, it's your energy, it's development, it's reproduction, it's body temperature. Like, your endocrine system regulates like all the things, basically. And so interference in that system, as kind of logically assume, is that it would cause some downstream problems there. And so this class of chemicals that it's known as endocrine disrupting chemicals, there's about 1,000 of them that are identified as known or suspected to be endocrine disruptors. My hunch is that number will balloon exponentially as we do more research. As I mentioned, we've only really started to examine a tiny fraction of the chemicals that are in commerce. In the United States, we like to say there's like 84,000 chemicals in commerce. We don't actually know that the accuracy of that number. We used to say that there was about 150,000 chemicals worldwide. A new analysis, I think that was published just this year, discovered that we're actually closer to 350,000 chemicals worldwide. so there's a lot. And so because we've only looked at a small pocket of them, like I said, there's about 1,000 of these endocrine disruptors. And then there's subclasses. So there's like chemicals can be endocrine disruptors and also be obesogens, diabetogens, like that. And those obesogens is sort of origin of what I started looking at. But these endocrine disrupting chemicals can block or mimic our natural hormones in our body, or can interfere with their synthesis or their metabolism. They're kind of like masquerading as our natural hormones, and they can turn on or turn off, things in the body that maybe shouldn't have been turned on or shouldn't have been turned off, and then cause all these downstream effects. And what's really challenging is a single endocrine disruptor like BPA, which is one of the ones that people tend to be most familiar with. As I like to say, it has the most street cred because people see it, labels BPA free all the time. And we can talk about that in a minute. But is that, these chemicals are ubiquitous. One, so we're all being exposed, but two, a single chemical like BPA has so many different endpoints of potential impact. And we can't say for a given person, you were exposed to BPA, you are going to end up with this symptom or that symptom. We don't know yet what the outcome is going to be. We can see here's the menu of things that we think might result or is likely result from exposure to BPA, or that BPA is linked to or associated with, but we can't say, you were exposed to BPA, therefore you're going to have this outcome. So, that area of research is still kind of in the dark. We don't know that yet. And I think that uncertainty is part of what industry, frankly, relies on. Right? They're like, well, we prove it. And then we're like, we can't prove it exactly. But we can look at, we can look at those rodent studies, we can look at epidemiological data and make strong cases for. But I think that part is challenging. But going back to the sort of general topic of endocrine disruption, is that we have these low levels of exposures day in, day out to these chemicals that are bioactive in the body, meaning that they're doing things, they're turning things on, they're docking in our estrogen receptors or what have you, they're bumping iodine out of our thyroid, which we need for optimal health on all levels. Most people will come and say, but the amount that's, of this exposure that we're getting is so small, it doesn't really matter. And that's the sort of the company line of industries that use endocrine disrupting chemicals. The amount in our product is so small, it doesn't matter. Well, if that was the only exposure that somebody was getting, right? If they only got that one exposure from that one product, one time, sure, not a problem at all, no big deal. But that's not the reality of human exposure. The reality of human exposure, to your point earlier, is that, some guy might be using 5 products, some woman might be using 10 products, a teenager might be using 20 products, right? They use more products than anyone. And those are just personal care products, right? We're not looking at laundry detergent and household cleaners and home fragrances and whether or not you're driving with one of those Christmas tree air fresheners in your car, right? So we're not exposed to one single product. We are exposed to hundreds of products all day, every day. So that's sort of one point to keep in mind. The other point is that our body is naturally designed to be responsive to really minute levels of hormones in the human body. That's how the human body works. The hormones that course through our veins are doing so at extraordinarily low levels, like parts per trillion levels, really, really tiny. And the way that I like to say it is that our hormones are communicators, they're messengers, and that they communicate in whispers.
Yes.
It's really quiet, really little amount, really, really, really little. And, you've ever, either for people that have gone through puberty or have had children that have gone through puberty or gone through menopause, like they don't feel like insignificant. those are not giant fluctuations. Those are relatively small fluctuations in hormones that cause these like major fluctuations in how we experience life during those times. And so we know that the body is extraordinarily receptive and responsive to these really tiny levels of hormones, because that's how our physiology is evolved. And so when we have similarly low levels of exposure to these chemicals that interfere with hormones, it logically makes sense. And we see this, out in animal studies, that the low levels of exposure that we're getting, these parts per billion, parts per trillion levels of some chemical in your drinking water or some chemical in your shampoo day in, day out, that those chemicals are bioactive in the human body at those levels. And the body can't tell the difference in a lot of cases between a molecule of, say, estradiol and a molecule of BPA, because they're almost the same. And so this is where this idea that endocrine disrupting chemicals are really concerning at all levels of the human lifespan. They are most damaging. They are most concerning during fetal development, and I would even say backed up before that when it comes to conception and healthy the ability to conceive, right? Because a lot of these chemicals interfere with the health of sperm counts, of egg health, of all of these different factors in human fertility, and then this sort of most vulnerable, which is the developing fetus. That's like, it's building. It's building a Lego set, right? With a Lego set. And imagine somebody coming in and taking out a bunch of Legos or throwing in some other Lego pieces that are like, faulty. You can't undo that structure once it's built, faulty as it might be, because of this endocrine disruption. And so this really is the most vulnerable population. And what I think is fascinating and makes sense given disease rates that are happening in children right now. Childhood obesity has tripled since the 1970s. We're seeing all kinds of, whether it's learning disabilities, behavioral problems, all of these different things that are kind of ticking up in children, is that there is this concept called, we've got a couple different names. FEBAD is one of them, is fetal basis for adult disease, or fetal origins of adult disease, which states that it is that what's happening in the womb during fetal development that can actually set you up for increased risk of disease in adulthood. So you were talking earlier about, there's some people that just struggle with losing weight. It's entirely possible, and we've seen this in rodent studies, that they were exposed unknowingly by their parents while they were in utero to these obesogenic chemicals that can alter their fat cell production, or alter their bodies in ways that predispose them to gain weight, even given the same caloric intake as somebody who maybe was not exposed. And so that might explain some of those differences, why somebody can eat whatever they want and never gain a pound. And then you've got somebody who looks at something wrong and then they just, put on five or 10 pounds. So, so that's sort of the gist with endocrine disruption, is that these small doses really, really matter, more so even than some of these large doses, which our toxicology field really looks at those high dose exposures. And so we can certainly talk about that end of the conversation as well.
Well, I think it's really invaluable for people to understand that these exposures can be cumulative, and that's important to understand that, we have hormones in our bodies that are designed to play a particular role unless they get dysregulated, either due to lifestyle choices, the way we eat, the lack of sleep, too much stress, the things we're exposed to in our environment, food, personal care products. And so there can be a lot of information. And I love that you kind of touched on the epigenetics. So obviously things that we're exposed to through our parents, During my nutrition training, we talked about Pottinger's cats, meaning, if you're looking at generations or lineages of certain cats, and people are going to say, why are you talking about cats? And the point is that there were certain phenotypes of cats that the healthy cats, were derived from, cats that ate a particular type of diet, more nutrient dense, and then other cats who ended up having a lot of health problems who ate very differently. And so there's so many variables that impact how we're able to be flexible with our health or our weight. I also think about, there's lots of studies, as I know, about just the changes in bacteria in our gut can impact how many calories will be broken down and utilized. And so, there's on so many levels, as we use the term multifactorial, so many reasons why this can happen. But you mentioned and touched on BPA. And I think about, like, my biggest association with BPA when I had younger kids, it was with bottles, because bottles. And it was like BPA free, which I later learned is crap and garbage anyway. It's not any better. But I also think about receipts. Like, every day you go to the store and you get a receipt, and 99.9% of the time I say, no, thank you, unless I genuinely need it. And then I have a little plastic bag, which isn't ideal, but then I don't have to touch it. And then if I need to scan it, it's scanned. But what are some of the other more common obesogens that you can think of? Like, I always think about phthalates, which is spelled like, no one ever spells that word right. I jokingly say, it's like, if they could have just spelled it with an F and not a PH.
Would have been a little bit easy. PHTH. Yes. Like, what other words start PHTH? Mm-hmm. So BPA certainly is a big one. It's one of the most common chemicals in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. It's expected that 93% of the population has BPA metabolites in their body at any given time. And I'll continue down on that list, but I'll pause here and say, and this is true for phthalates as well, is that some of these chemicals that we're exposed to they're non-persistent. They don't build up in the body. We might be exposed to them a lot, but they don't build up in the body. So there's other chemicals, like lead, which deposits in our bone. That's a lifetime store of lead in our bones. There's, PCBs, dioxins. There's these fat soluble persistent chemicals that are really, really hard for the body to get rid of. Those are problematic on a whole nother level. But these non-persistent chemicals like BPA, like phthalates, like organophosphate pesticides, that's another one that we can talk about. These are non-persistent chemicals. And so the body knows how to metabolize them pretty well and breaks them down, and you pee them out. And so some people are like, oh, well, that's the body doing what it's supposed to do, which is great. It's true. And the short amount of time that these chemicals are in the body, they can still have an effect, a negative effect, right? So they can come in, flip a bunch of switches, and then peace out of the body. So they're problematic on their way in and on their way out. But what that tells us in terms of their short transit time is that when we reduce exposures, right, we can actually have a meaningful impact on the long-term levels of these chemicals in our bodies to some degree. And so I like to preface this because, it's a little overwhelming for people when they learn about this stuff. So there is a sort of a light at the end of the tunnel. I like to kind of frame it that way. So yes, BPA is certainly one of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that's also classified as an obesogen. Not all obesogens are endocrine disrupting chemicals. Not all endocrine disrupting chemicals are obesogens that we know of. So BPA is one, phthalates are another. Phthalates are, again, spelled PHTHALATES. To slap the person who decided to come up with that phthalate ester name. And so phthalates are another ubiquitous chemical. They're suspected to be in 98% of at least the US population. And these are found in both in soft plastics and in fragranced items. So perfume, shampoos, household cleaners, laundry detergents, scented candles, air fresheners, all of those products that are so commonplace. Most people have some or most of these, fragranced items. My next door neighbors, I have to close my windows when they do their laundry because their smell of their detergent and their dryer sheets is so pungent. I mean, it will wake me up out of to sleep. I don't know why they sometimes do their laundry at literally 3 a.m. But I have had to wake up and close my windows at like 3 a.m. because I can just smell their dryer sheets coming in. So all of those products utilize, or most of those products will utilize phthalates to make the fragrance formula stick around longer and be persistent, because they want that to be persistent. And so, you know, when I see advertisements for laundry products that have these like scent release beads that will extend the amount of time that your laundry will smell like the product by weeks or months, I'm just going, well, you've just jacked up the amount of fragrance and the amount of phthalates to extend that. And so phthalates are ubiquitous within scented products. That's all our personal care and household cleaner products. And then they're also found, like I said, in soft plastics. So if we think, and in particular, anything that's made of PVC. Mm-hmm. So whether that's a PVC backpack, a raincoat, your shower curtain, your kid's Halloween mask, a garden hose, these are all typically made of PVC. And so if we think of PVC as polyvinyl chloride, we think of a PVC pipe. In order to make that pipe soft and flexible, phthalates are added to add that sort of resiliency, that component to that type of plastic. And so those phthalates will migrate out very, very easily into their surrounding environment. So for example, shower curtains, people, such a benign, like, why are we talking about shower curtains? But shower curtains are, that plastic smell that you're smelling, those are phthalates. And we don't want to use those. It's just an unnecessary exposure. And so phthalates are a well-established endocrine disruptor and obesogenic chemical. I mentioned organophosphate pesticides. This is the newer class of pesticides. It used to be organochlorine pesticides. These were highly persistent and were building up. This was the whole DDT, thinning of, eggshells for eagles and birds, that really Rachel Carson brought to the world's attention in the 1960s with the publication of her book, Silent Spring, which is hailed as the book that really kicked off the environmental movement. She was a woman way ahead of her time who was silently battling cancer while fighting this big fight. So she is a hero among humans. I really believe she was just a brilliant woman. So she really rang the alarm bells about that. And because of that, we kind of decided as a society to let's find a better replacement for those really persistent toxic chemicals. So we did take action there, and we swapped them out with organophosphate pesticides. So no organochlorines, yes, organophosphates. They're way less persistent. They're not really less toxic, right? They're differently toxic. And so those are also chemicals that we're being exposed to. A primary exposure source is through food, right? Is through the consumption of conventionally grown fruits and vegetables. Obviously, if people are utilizing lawn and garden pesticides that they're buying at Home Depot, you're getting a major additional source there. If somebody's working occupationally as a landscaper, as an agricultural worker, they're getting an absolutely enormous amplified level of exposure. Those are occupational exposures that are really, really concerning. But these are, again, this non-persistent chemical that we can actually significantly reduce our exposures to as individuals through the purchasing of organically grown foods. And there's been at least 5 or 6 studies at this point that have sort of repeated these same findings, which is often an argument. Oh, you can't reproduce the findings, except that they have many times at this point. When people switch from a conventional diet to an organic diet, they can drop the circulating levels of pesticides being excreted in the urine by 80 to 90% in 3 to 5 days.
That's unbelievable.
So yeah, and it's that's sort of this sort of light at the end of the tunnel, right? Mm-hmm. We can have a meaningful, measurable effect on the levels of chemicals that we're bringing in by not bringing them in. Now I'll say, because I think this is an important whole other facet to this conversation, is that there are millions of people in this country and elsewhere around the world that don't have access. They can't afford organic food. They can't afford the non-toxic skincare. And that's a whole other dynamic of this conversation. So I'm cognizant as I give these recommendations for people to make lifestyle changes to minimize their exposures, that some of these recommendations are not accessible to all people. And that is really where we need to be more vocal advocates, in the same way that, like, you said, when you had little kids and the baby bottles was the big source of BPA. The reason why that was BPA, not the other bisphenols, because BPA is just one in a family. BPA was actually banned from use in baby bottles, was because moms were like not having it. And they like rolled it was called the stroller brigade, and they like rolled their babies up onto the lawns of Congress and their state houses. And like, what politician is going to say no to a bunch of moms with babies? That's like, and so they really used their power in the marketplace to demand change. And so in addition to serving our own best interests by minimizing our exposures in the ways that we can, I think we also really need to fight and advocate for stronger policies that will protect those that don't have the access to, buying organic food, for example.
I think it's
So,
really, sorry.
yeah. No, go ahead. That was a lot.
No, I think that was a beautiful explanation. I think it really is important that those of us are a voice for all individuals, and not just advocating for, where we live geographically, but acknowledging that there are people who don't have the ability to make all those decisions seamlessly. I trained in inner city Baltimore, and I remember one of the projects that we were always working on with the kids was trying to, instill gardens that the kids could be involved in, because, for example, in the inner city, people's access to food is oftentimes the hyper palatable, highly processed stuff in like a corner market. And when I say market, it's not like the market that we're thinking of. And so really instilling that joy and that love for actually getting their hands in the dirt and, allowing something to grow, and just being cognizant that, I never want to just advocate for just my own children. I want to make sure that we're advocating for all the kids, or all the, young adults, or all the young women that are, for example, and this is again, kind of a tangential comment, but when you're thinking about, as women start menstruating and, they're considering, becoming sexually active, and they're considering options for contraception, and just acknowledging that not everyone has the ability to go buy organic tampons or a Diva cup. Right. It's like, okay, we need to come up with workable solutions for everybody, because, it needs to be as equitable as we can make it, or at least have manufacturers providing more options than just the bleached cotton. That's right. I mean, anyway, we could talk just about that.
That's a whole other facet that I think is important. But going back to the pesticides, right? So doing our best to minimize our exposures there. There's so many other areas of exposure to these endocrine disrupting chemicals. And in an attempt to kind of make at least the parts of this conversation as equitable as possible, is the lens that I really am looking more closely through is getting people to start where it's free and where it's easy. Like, that's kind of my tag in this, or the way in which I want people to approach this is, it's not about, like you said, it's not about going in and like getting rid of everything all at once. It's not about like throwing out your furniture and ripping up your flooring and like doing a whole home remodel. Like, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about making small but meaningful changes, lifestyle wise, that can help to lower. You're never going to eliminate your toxic exposure. We've long passed that point. We can't do that, but we can minimize it in meaningful ways. And I'll give you an example of in meaningful ways. So in research around fertility, where they're looking at levels of chemicals like BPA and phthalates in women that are undergoing IVF treatments. The women that had the highest levels of exposure to, say, for example, phthalates, had significantly, were significantly affected by or had lower fertility rates. And the women that had the lowest levels, not none, just the lowest levels, didn't have those same fertility hurdles that women with a higher level. So our goal is not zero, our goal is less. That's our goal. And so I thought that that specific research kind of shines a light on the reality. We're not looking for zero. We're just looking to get as low as we can because that's where we can kind of start to see a positive impact. And so we want to start with the things that are free and easy that everybody can do. And so the first of those things for me is always just ditch, just throw out, just don't donate it, just throw it out. The scented candles, the air fresheners, the reed diffusers, the plugins, the Febreze, home air freshener products, those are all filled with phthalates. They're also filled with other chemicals, VOCs, things like benzenes, which are carcinogenic. And they're significant indoor air pollutants. And so just don't buy them. I know it's and this can be challenging because people love they're so attached to their home fragrances and their scents. And I get that can be challenging, but I encourage people strongly to just start minimizing it and then go without. Even if the scented candle isn't being burned, if you can smell it, it's entering your body. The fastest way for a chemical to enter your body outside of injection is via inhalation. It goes right into your bloodstream. So let's focus on those ones that we're inhaling. And on the same token, the next thing that people can do that's free and easy is open your windows, right? So we build our homes to be really energy efficient, which is great from an energy standpoint, but it's terrible from an indoor air quality standpoint. And that really took place in the 1970s. That started being a build trend in the 1970s because we had the OPEC oil embargo. So everything all of a sudden became about energy efficiency. And then our homes started to be built really, really airtight. And what that means, or the impact that has is, most of the materials that we bring into our homes, off-gas chemicals, your floors, the paint on your walls, your furniture, especially if it's that cheaper particle board, MDF furniture. Our kitchen cabinets are often made of this stuff. Our flooring is vinyl or laminate flooring, and all of these materials, not even factoring in the scented candles and the air fresheners, are off-gassing. And if our homes are really airtight, then we're trapping all those chemicals in. So, and we know this, the EPA has found that indoor air is actually 2 to 5 times worse than outdoor air. And it can go up to 100 times worse, especially if somebody's doing a renovation or they're painting. That indoor air quality, technically, if it was a workplace, would violate OSHA standards in a lot of cases, right? And so, but there's nobody that regulates indoor air because it's individual private property. And so opening your windows is a great way to just kind of let that stuff out and get some fresh air in. Even if you're in a city that has air pollution problems, you don't have to leave them open all day, 10 minutes a day, it's fine. So opening your windows, taking off your shoes when you come in the door, really simple. Anybody can do this. We're not just trying to avoid the dog poop that we may have stepped on, but if we went to the park or if your neighbors are using pesticides on their lawn, you are tracking that into your house. If you have carpets in your house, then those carpets are kind of trapping all those things. So just get into the habit of taking your shoes off. It's really, really simple. And then, from there, we're really looking at making small investments, maybe swapping out your plastic storage containers. We talked about BPA and phthalates. Those two chemicals are often present in our food storage containers, like whether it's leftovers or the squeezable bottle of ketchup that we, just bought. So we want to start really minimizing plastic, and especially plastic in the microwave. We just don't do that. Move it into a glass bowl or a plate, ceramic plate, and stick it in the microwave if you're going to use that, but don't microwave, and plastic. So that's another simple thing that people can do to minimize their exposures to some of these endocrine disrupting chemicals, these obesogenic chemicals. And then from there, it's cleaning up your food when, in whatever ways you're able to. It's cleaning up your personal care products, your household cleaners, your cookware. So like, there's just, I'll tell you, I've been doing this for 12 years. 10 years professionally, 12 years personally, and I'm still always making changes. Like there's no goal here. It's a journey. There's no destination in place. This is just always learning and always, making different choices as you are able to. And if it takes a month, takes a month. If it takes a year, it takes a year. If it takes 10 years, it takes 10 years.
I think that's kind of slow and steady message is important for people to understand. I know that, when I went from, I thought I ate a pretty good diet to getting more conscientious about the foods I was eating, and obviously the foods I was cooking and bringing home, I adapted much more easily than my husband did. Now he's fully on board, but there were definitely specific things. I'll give you an example. Seed oils was one of the things that my husband, he had to like read about it, go do the research. And as an engineer, then he was like, okay, checkbox, I can commit to that. One thing in our house, and I'm sure it's probably no different than anyone else's, we have no nonstick pans anymore, but I know that was really hard for my husband, who likes to make omelets and wants to flip the omelet, wants to do all these fancy things when he makes said omelet. Nonstick cookware, I think we've all been conditioned that this is like ease of use, which of course it is, but I think what many people don't realize, and again, this is but one example, the nonstick surface you end up actually ingesting. So as it's breaking down, you're ingesting those chemicals into your own body, which is disgusting. It's like, oh, the nonstick surface is worn off. I'm like, oh, it's because we've been eating it.
Yeah. And I think also, and those chemicals are concerning. So those are called PFAS chemicals. They're in our drinking water. They're major environmental pollutant. They're referred to as forever chemicals. So though they don't break down, they biopersist in our bodies, they build up, they're hugely problematic. If people want to learn more about this, they can go to Netflix and watch The Devil We Know documentary. They can go watch Dark Waters, which is a film with Mark Ruffalo that is based on the same story that the Dark Waters documentary explores, which is this DuPont's production of these nonstick chemicals that they've known about for decades causing health effects, and they suppress that information and were polluting drinking water of people living in Parkersburg, West Virginia, that ended up developing all types of serious and fatal illnesses. And so it's a pretty shocking yet common occurrence when it comes. So it's a common representation or good representation of what often happens behind the scenes when we're looking at chemicals and their health effects and the lengths that industries will go to protect their profits over people. Yeah. So it's a real eye opener. But those PFAS chemicals, like, yes, I never advocate for nonstick cookware. I think it's a hard no for me. And nonstick cookware is not actually our most significant source of exposure to those chemicals. Those exposures are more likely, even though I still want people to swap them out, right? Because they're not good to utilize, not only for ourselves, but when we're disposing them, we're still contributing to the manufacturing process, to the harming and pollution of, different communities, often communities of color or low-income communities where these factories are situated. And so it's not just about protecting our health. This is also my argument for organic food. It's not just about me. It is about all the farm workers. It is about all the agricultural workers that are being exposed at really high levels, and then bringing those exposures home to their children and their families. And so we're getting exposure to PFAS chemicals through food packaging, through our pizza boxes, our microwave food containers, any kind of paper that utilizes or that's going to be in contact with a wet, hot, or oily food. They need to make that paper waterproof, or grease proof. So microwave popcorn, big exposure source to PFAS, because the entire inside of that bag is lined or coated in this PFAS chemical. We're also being exposed through like our stain proof Sprays. So I see folks with the stain-proof sprays for their boots to keep their suede nice. Those are typically PFAS chemicals. And I don't have confirmation on this, but I don't see how it wouldn't be PFAS chemicals. Rain-X, which is that, buy it at the hardware store, you wipe it on your windows so that the water beads off. It's great. It's super helpful. But it is a hydrophobic liquid that is very likely just PFAS chemicals. And then we're also being exposed through our drinking water. PFAS is found in firefighting foam. So if you live near an airport, if you live near a military base, military is one of the largest polluters in the world, unfortunately, with various chemicals that they just dump into the groundwater and pollute communities and environments. And so PFAS chemicals we're being exposed in lots of different places, but yes, ditch the nonstick. My favorite recommendation, I'm a cast iron girl, but now I'm a cast iron and carbon steel girl. And so carbon steel has the same properties as cast iron. So it does require the same kind of babying that cast iron does, meaning you can't let it soak, you can't let your food sit in it, you have to coat it with oil before you put it away, that kind of stuff. But it's really lightweight, it's very, very thin. So one of the objections with cast iron is it's really heavy. Mm-hmm. So carbon steel is if you think of a traditional wok, it's really thin. It's thinner than stainless steel. It's really thin and lightweight. Now carbon steel, and sometimes it takes a while, but you can get your seasoning. It has a smoother finish than most cast iron.
Okay.
And it also is so lightweight that you can flip it. So you can flip an omelet and you can have a fried egg slide off. I had one this morning on my carbon steel pan and it just slides right out, just like a nonstick pan would. It does require some cooking skill, and it does require learning how to season and utilize those pans. So it's not as lazy as a nonstick is, where you don't have to have any skill. You just crack your egg and it's there. And so I think that if people can put in a little bit of effort to learn how to use these pans, how to actually cook properly, don't put cold meat into a hot pan, that kind of stuff, you can achieve a fairly nonstick finish with much safer materials.
Well, you've given me certainly something to think about. I want to be mindful of your time, and I'm actually going to absolutely positively bring you back because we could have gone in so many different directions.
Oh my gosh, yes.
When just touching back on the personal care products, I've always kind of sent people to environmental working groups website, to Skin Deep, to kind of plug in products. When people are looking at, cleaner deodorants, cleaner lotion, I usually recommend people start with toothpaste, and, I give them a couple things to think about because it's just too overwhelming to change them all. And for full disclosure, it took forever for me to go from antiperspirant deodorant to just deodorant, because I was convinced by the lovely, the processed food industry and the big ag companies that sweating was a bad thing. And now I think about it, it makes me laugh. I'm like, your bodies are designed to sweat because it's a way that we detoxify. But I know people oftentimes are very fearful to switch out to a cleaner product because they think they're going to stink and they think that it's not going to be effective. And so what are some of the ways or resources that you usually send people to? Because that will probably come out of this podcast. People will be asking, what do you use? What do you like to use? What are your resources? So I'm preemptively going to ask that question before it comes.
That's great. I mean, and it is overwhelming. And so there's the first resource I'll point to is my own website, because I've curated a bunch of sort of shopping guides for folks of products that I've personally vetted that I think are good. And there's 10 categories, skincare, beauty care, makeup, hair care, oral care, feminine care, cookware, all the stuff. So that's a shortcut where people can go. There's also, at least when it comes to personal care products, there's a couple of really great stores. I link them on my skincare and beauty care pages on my site. Stores like the Detox Market, like Credo Beauty, because what these companies have done is essentially created a marketplace where they have vetted, dozens of brands that have stepped into this sort of clean beauty space. And I'm using air quotes there because it's a really an unregulated, phrase or concept. And so there's lots of different interpretations, and there's a lot of what's called clean washing or greenwashing that happens, where companies are like, yeah, our products are clean, and then like, but according to who? And so there's a lot of sort of disingenuous marketing that's happening out there, which is why I like companies like the Detox Market or Credo Beauty or Folane is another one, because they're vetting these products and saying like, these are our standards, and these are the chemicals that we don't want to see in the products that we sell. They're not always 100% perfect, but as I mentioned earlier, like I'm not picky about perfection. I'm not. I just want people to be doing better, making better choices. And so those stores are a great resource. They've got, all of the personal care products for men and women that you would need. And that's really where I tend to point people. I don't actually tend to point people to the environmental working groups databases, because I think most people truly find them to be overwhelming. And while you might find products there, you won't find those products in a store, right? So like, then you have to go through all of these hoops to jump through to be like, well, I found a product that's great, and like, but now I have to figure out where to buy it, and or maybe they don't sell direct, and well, they're not at my local co-op or my local health food store, so like now I'm back to square one, right? And so I think, and they've kind of worked their way out because they've got the EWG verified. That's sort of the same concept as like Detox Market. So there are resources out there. I think those are, the ones that I mentioned. People can hop over to my website if they just want the shortcut. Like, here's the basics that I think, people need. But yeah, I mean, I don't want people to feel overwhelmed, because when people are overwhelmed, they don't do anything. Right? They're kind of frozen in inaction. And, even if the action is small, like I said, if it's ditching the scented products in your home, if it's opening your windows, just start there. And then if you're at the place where your deodorant or antiperspirant runs out and you need to buy a new one, then you can switch to a better product. You don't have to go and throw out the products that you have. That's money that you spent. You can utilize them. If you feel like throwing them out, great. But otherwise, just use them up. And then when you're ready to replace them, you can go to one of those resources and say, let me try this deodorant, or let me try that line of shampoo, and see, see how they do. And keep in mind, and I think this is a challenge for a lot of people, especially when it comes to deodorants and hair care specifically, is like, everyone's body chemistry is different. So like, not every product is going to work the same for every person. And the same thing with hair. Everybody's hair is different. Is it oily? Is it dry? Is it textured? Is it straight? Like, what's the climate that you live in? And so the one shampoo product isn't going to work for anybody. And I have tried some bad shampoos, like real bad shampoos. Companies send me products all the time to try, and I'm like, sure, great. And there's, been a handful where I'm like, yeah, I can't, I'm sorry. It just didn't work for me, and it might work for other people, but it was a no for me. So like, there is an experimentation process when you're looking to swap out particularly personal care products, until you find the one that works for you. So I think prefacing that for people going in, I don't want them to try one product and be like, this doesn't work.
Yeah. No, and I think that the emphasis on bio-individuality, acknowledging that we all are very unique individuals. I can tell you that I have, despite having very fine hair, I have a lot of it. And on the East Coast, where the humidity is out of control right now, this time of the year, I tell people all the time, I'm like, all bets are off in the summer. I'm more often than not, my hair is in a ponytail, and it's the only way it can be controlled, because otherwise it's like the size of New Jersey.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring you back on because there've been so many questions about water, the scope of the issue around water, the scope of contamination. You really do a beautiful job with your content. And I thought I could not think of any better person that I wanted to come on and really dive into, what has gone on with the lack of regulation. Obviously, Silent Spring might have started the discussion 50, 60 years ago. But when we're really looking at the scope of the problem, even now, even in, 2022, hard to believe, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago that book came out. where do things kind of stem from? What were the concerns, for the benefit of the listeners? What were the concerns that were expressed in this book that kind of got the tide changing in terms of government looking a little more closely at things we were exposed to, contaminants, environmental pollutants, et cetera, that were brought up in this book that I really think about as really changing the trajectory of looking at how water can be a benefit and can also be profoundly detrimental as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, you know, a seminal work in this whole conversation. Rachel Carson's 1962 Silent Spring is credited with kind of launching what we now know as this environmental movement. And she really made an incredibly strong and highly referenced scientific a chronicle, if you will, but delivered in this like prose. She was a beautiful writer that really detailed the connection between pesticides that we put on our agricultural crops and how that affects wildlife, and then ultimately how that can in turn affect us. And so she was kind of probably, I would say, one of the first to make that connection. This sort of skipped connection, like it's not just the agricultural use and then us, it's that it's passing through wildlife and they're being affected, and the potential for us also being affected is significant. And that really did put a spotlight on a conversation that people weren't really having at that time. And it really, you know, DDT was the chemical that she really focuses on a lot in that book. It's not the only one that she talks about. And her research and the writing and publishing of that book is ultimately what led to the phase out of DDT. So it was like a pretty big deal. And it's definitely one of those books that you can read now. And a lot of her quotes, a lot of the things that she says in there can ring just as loudly and just as true today as they did in the 1960s. And that's kind of heartbreaking to me to think, like, you know, we've advanced so much, we understand so much more about environmental chemicals and their fate in the environment and how they can kind of cycle back to us, and, you know, chemicals in consumer products and how they affect us. And yet we haven't really progressed too much in the way that we regulate chemicals. And certainly water is one of the places where we have really poor regulations here in the United States. There's millions of pounds of industrial chemicals that are legally dumped into our waterways every year because there is no regulation on the amount of chemical that can be present in the water systems. And so if there's no limit that's set, companies can dump kind of with impunity, like they don't care, and there's no fine, and it's legal. And that's a huge problem, right? So I think with the conversation of water and like drinking water and tap water, you know, I think we have to put it into perspective. So there are plenty of developing countries around the world that have communicable diseases that are transmitted through water. So like we don't really have that problem. And we don't have that problem because of modernization and, you know, disinfection and different treatments. And so in some ways, like, yeah, sure, water is a lot better than in other places. But just because we don't have communicable diseases like typhoid and dysentery and cholera in our water, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily better. It's just different. We have different set of problems in industrialized nations with our water quality. And that's why I'm such a big advocate and pretty vocal about talking about this topic, because people assume that their water is good because you live in America. And that is not good, is relative, is a very subjective term. So yeah, it's a big topic.
Well, and I think having had the opportunity to travel outside the United States in the past year, I was in Rwanda, and then I was in Tanzania in September with my husband, and I was pretty impressed with Rwanda's focus. I mean, it's probably the cleanest country I've ever visited in my entire life.
Yeah.
And the Rwandan people are absolutely lovely and so committed to ensuring that they remain happy, healthy, committed to supporting one another. I mean, they spend one day out of the month, pre-pandemic, cleaning. I mean, literally cleaning outside. Like even the president will go out and pick up trash and garbage. So they're very committed, but people travel miles to get water.
Yeah.
They have these little yellow jugs. And so I kept saying to my husband, when we think about the fact I have teenage boys, and sometimes the shower runs a long time. And oftentimes it's not because the child is in the shower, it's because they turn it on, they go downstairs to get something, they come upstairs, they get distracted by their phone. And I've tried to explain to them, such a valuable commodity, and yet it's oftentimes not appreciated and valued. And so I think, kind of starting the conversation from there and saying, yes, we assume, being in the United States or in a westernized country, that the water that we have available to us is clean, it's free of contaminants, it's free of cancer or carcinogenic type things, it's free of plastics, it's free of hormones. And so through the conversation today, we will definitely touch on all of these areas. But one thing I found really interesting when I was going through some of your material and really looking at, acts that had been passed, the EPA was developed in the early 1970s, maybe 1970.
Yeah.
Yep. They had the Safe Drinking Water Act. And then we kind of assume someone else is looking out for our best interests. And I'll be the first person to say, never assume that a governmental regulating agency is focused more on your health than they are on, in some instances, being affiliated with big ag and corporations that are giving them a lot of money to be quiet about things that are not properly regulated. So when we're thinking about big things that we should be conscientious or concerned about, the things that kind of stood out for me were, as you mentioned, agricultural pesticides, obviously, depending on where you live in the country, pharmaceuticals. And I want everyone to think about this. We don't think about this enough. I, as a prescribing provider, didn't think about this a whole lot until I kind of read some of your material and said, okay, how many women are on oral contraceptives? How many people are taking synthetic or bioidentical
antidepressants in the water? There's antibiotics in the water. I mean, we have to think that when we take these medications, our bodies don't utilize all of it. And when they metabolize in our livers and they get, we pee them out, we're peeing out. If you're taking birth control, you're peeing out those estrogen, estradiols or whatever. And, those molecules are incredibly tiny. And so our water treatment plants that process our water and clean our water, like they don't often have the capacity to filter those out. And so they kind of just recirculate constantly in the water system. And, we don't, this is the challenge with a lot of, especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals, is like, we don't have data that I'm aware of the direct implications for human health on that. Can we make an educated guess that, like, hey, if we're taking micro doses of antibiotics every day unknowingly in our drinking water, or antidepressants, or whatever it is, that might be a problem. I think it's not a stretch by any means to say, like, maybe we don't know if it's a problem 100%, but like, it can't be good that they're in there. Like, there can't be a net positive benefit for everyone that's there. And, I think there was a university study years ago that was actually looking at, they'd created some framework or formula to predict how many drug users there were in their community based on the residues of narcotics in the water supply. So like they could extrapolate, like, the average user is going to do this, they're going to pee out this much. Let's do some big math, figure that out. And then we can say, hey, there's, maybe 3,000 people that are using crystal meth or cocaine or whatever, or heroin in the system in this community. And so, I'm not suggesting that those are the biggest concerns. I would say those are actually probably quite low on the totem pole of, or the priority list, I should say, of, what we're being exposed to in our drinking water. And I think the thing that is challenging for people to kind of grasp, and actually am getting ready to release a video that actually walks through my own water testing report, is that everyone's water is different. Everyone's water has a different set of challenges. And this is where in the sort of influencer social media space, I have a bone to pick with folks that are like, this is the water filter you should get, because they're affiliates for that brand. I'm an affiliate for a lot of products, but like, I don't actually promote specific water filtration systems on purpose, because I don't know if it's the right filter for you, because I don't know what's in your water. And there's so many different variables that can determine the thumbprint, so to speak, of your contaminant profile. I moved from the Pacific Northwest in Oregon to New Mexico. My water is totally different, completely different, and requires some specialized filtration because of how different it is. And so, I think this is, like a lot of things, we are looking for the easy button. We're looking to just like go into Costco or Home Depot or Target and just like buy a filter off the shelf. To me, that's a yes, and anything is better than nothing, but we don't know if it's actually doing the thing that we need it to.
I think that's an important distinction, much like I always say, bioindividuality rules. Well, all of our water might be very different. I have a good friend who left the Washington, D.C. area and said the water was better in Northern Virginia than it is where she is in San Diego. And I was shocked. So are there areas of the country where you feel like municipalities or certain cities are kind of leading the way in terms of looking at whether it's, advanced filtration systems? Obviously, there are examples on the opposite end of the spectrum. There are tragic examples. I lived and trained in Baltimore, and there were issues with lead pipes, and just people were exposed to so many things, just living in older communities. And so I'm curious if you feel like there are any communities that are kind of on your radar, or parts of the country where people are doing an exceptionally good job.
Not really. I think this is another, this sort of slides into another facet of this conversation, which is, first of all, I'll say this: our water infrastructure in the United States is very old. So our water treatment plants typically have a 30 or 40-year lifespan. We are at a point in time when the majority of our water treatment plants have surpassed their useful life. They were built decades ago, and they don't have the capacity to filter out PFAS and microplastics and herbicides and pesticides. They weren't designed for that. And so, we have this problem where we have like an entire nationwide system that is in desperate need of a major economic, injection of cash to overhaul this system. The American Society of Civil Engineers, which is the organization that like rates our nation's infrastructure, like it rates our roads and our bridges, they give our water infrastructure like a C or a C minus, and that's up from like a D. Like it's been in the C/D range for the decade that I've been doing this work. And it's going to cost billions of dollars to overhaul that. So first, we have a crumbling infrastructure. There are certainly some parts of the country, I think this is far less common, but they still have pipes in the city that date back to the Civil War, right? These are old systems. Biden actually just, I don't know what the outcome of this was, but there was discussion of, identifying and replacing lead pipes. There's millions of miles of lead pipes still in this country, all around the country. And we don't actually know, because there was no requirement for record keeping of like, which street has a lead pipe, which street doesn't. And so we've got millions of miles of lead piping, in our water delivery system that should probably be replaced. So to your question though, about like, are some places doing it better than others? Yes, those places are more affluent. So places that are more affluent have the resources to build multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art water treatment facilities. That's great. Would love to see more of that. But what we also see on the other end of the spectrum is that marginalized communities, low-income communities often have the worst. Not only do they have more industry situated in their communities, so that means more pollution on its own, they also don't often have the resources to modernize their water treatment and water distribution systems. So they kind of have this double layer of, this not ideal situation. And so the thing that makes the difference between a better water system and a not better water system is money. In money and motivation to prioritize water versus putting in a new stadium or doing whatever else you're going to do with your city resources.
It's certainly not a sexy topic, but
it's not sexy.
It's an important topic. And one thing that I think is really, really important for people to understand is that we have crumbling infrastructure combined with a degree of apathy, perhaps by politicians, to really tackle the hard discussions, because I'm sure in many ways they're thinking about revenue, and yes, bringing a new stadium in or bringing in a new airport is going to generate more money for the area that people live within. And it was interesting to me that, just the differences in geography in terms of if you're in, the part of the country where you have a lot of livestock or crops being maintained, the pesticide residue and things that you're exposed to are very different than someone perhaps who lives on the coast versus, as you mentioned, these urban areas. Certainly for me, having been a suburban girl my entire life, living in Baltimore was the best thing I could have ever done, because it shook me outside of my comfort zone and forced me to really see the way that my patients lived. It was a requirement of both programs that I did, that we had to do a lot of community outreach. And my discomfort was minimal compared to how these people were living. And I think about lead levels that we used to draw on children. This almost makes me cry when I think about this now, being a parent myself, the lead levels that we drew on children that were going to permanently impact their neurologic function for the rest of their lives. And they were young. And, if it wasn't lead paint, it was, other contaminants that were found in their water supply that was impacting them neurologically, cognitively. So this really is a problem for all of us to be concerned about. But I love that you are encouraging, and obviously we'll dive deeper into this, testing your water to know exactly what you need to be doing, because the blanket one size fits all recommendation as it pertains to protecting our water or improving our water could be very different. You take a cross section of the population, it could be very different for every single person. So I love that you're honoring that individuality portion, as opposed to just saying this Berkey filter is what everyone needs to use, and I'm going to live and die on my Berkey.
It's fine. And people are obsessed with their Berkeys. I'm like, I don't think that they should be, frankly. And, I think there's other factors aside from efficacy of removing contaminants. Like for 9 years lived in like a 600 square foot, 1-bedroom apartment in New York City. And I had 24 inches of counter space. Like I had a tiny little kitchen. I mean, it's a great place, but like I had the kind of kitchen where like, if you went to open the oven door, it would hit the fridge door. So you'd have to open the fridge in order to open the oven. Like I had that situation for 9 years. That's wonderful. But people at the time, even then, were like, oh, you should get a Berkey. I'm like, where am I going to put a Berkey? I don't have countertop space. I literally have, if you're in an efficiency apartment like that, every nook and cranny, under the couch, under the bed, everything is storage. And so, there's other factors to consider as well. Convenience, whether or not they rely on electricity, whether or not you have the space, whether or not you have the money. Like, sure, there's certain filters that I think are exceptionally good filters that will remove a large portion of most of the questionable contaminants, but they're like $500 or $600. And that's not helpful for me to be making blanket recommendation when maybe all somebody needs is a basic carbon filter that would cost them $100. So I don't like, I'm sensitive to making sure that, and not just within water, but within all facets of this conversation around environmental health, is like accessibility and not positioning, addressing environmental exposures as being something only for those who are affluent. It's an exclusionary way to have the conversation that I kind of take. I have a bone to pick with that type of delivery of this information. So I'm very sensitive to that, making it accessible. And that's hard. I mean, I had a conversation with a prospective student just recently, and she had taken, I have a course on water. She took the course. She's working in a low income community. And she's like, how do I bring this information to them? And I'm like, that's really hard. Like it's because it costs money. The interventions all cost money. And so this is where I think we have this we take this dual prong approach. We're like, sure, yeah, let's learn about how to deal with our individual water, but let's also at the same time be vocal about demanding better practices from our water utilities, from our federal regulations as they pertain to water. It's not, and there are some people, look, I live in New Mexico. The majority of New Mexico is reservation land. There are some people here who turn on the tap water and their water is brown, like it's mud brown, right? So like we have a big problem. And then just because your water looks clean and smells clean and it tastes good, doesn't mean it's not problematic. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have people that like literally can't drink the water, or people who live near hydrofracking operations, and their water, you can set their water on fire because it has so many flammable gas components in it. So like we have the whole spectrum here. So I think, again, going back to the like assumption that just because we don't have communicable diseases, that our water is great. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the EPA only regulates around 90 contaminants. There are hundreds that have been measured. And just because a contaminant is regulated doesn't mean that it's not showing up in excess in our water systems. This was a couple of years ago, but there was an analysis that found that like 77 million Americans are drinking water that violates the Safe Drinking Water Act. So just because a chemical is regulated doesn't mean that you're not still in violation. And the levels that the EPA sets under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and this sort of ties into this economic conversation, those are not health standards. So when we're looking at, so first of all, anybody in the United States, and I don't know if this is available outside, everybody does it differently. In the United States, your water utility is legally required to produce a water quality report. Sometimes it's referred to as a consumer confidence report, or CCR. They're legally required to produce these every year. They don't always do that. My city, for example, on the link that says 2021 is 2020's report, even though the file name is 2021, it's literally 2020's report. I don't know if that was a mistake or not, but either way. And so these water quality reports are produced by your water utility, and it tells you information about your water. It tells you where your water comes from. Does it come from an aquifer? Is it a surface water? Is it groundwater? They usually draw a little map. I guess it depends on how much money your community has. I've seen some really basic, like one sheets, just text and a table with numbers, and people are like, I don't know what I'm looking at. And then I've seen these like beautifully designed ones, right? And so, that have graphics and illustrations, but those reports will tell you a little bit about your water, where it comes from, what it's treated with, what are the levels that are tested and monitored, what's the lowest, the average level, what's the highest level. And their benchmark that they're using is the federal, it's called the maximum contaminant level, the MCL. And the MCL is that regulation threshold level, where if you exceed that level, that's in violation of the federal drinking water standards for that particular contaminant. The problem is that maximum contaminant level number is not a health standard. It is a negotiation between what public health experts would like to see and what the federal government feels is feasible to impose on all utilities across the country. So if they have to factor in that economic, like what's realistic, we can't tell everyone that the level of lead has to be zero, because we know a lot of municipalities, millions of them, don't have the funds, they don't have the resources to be able to meet the standard. And so it's a negotiation, but people think it's a health standard. So for example, on my water quality report, if we look at all of the levels that have been measured at the utility, so these are not measured at my house, they're measured at the utility, next to every single one, there's a little green check mark that says safe to drink per the EPA.
Oh.
But it's not a safety standard. It's just the regulatory standard. And that's incredibly misleading, I think, for a lot of contaminants.
Well, and I think many people, much to the point we assume what's in the grocery store is safe to eat, nutrient dense. I would argue most of what we find in the grocery store, and this could also, apply to chemicals you're exposed to that you bring into your home, etc. Now, you touched on some terminology that people may not be as familiarized with. So when we're talking about groundwater versus surface water, can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think on many levels, when people are looking at these reports, trying to decipher, depending on where they live in their municipalities, and certainly if you do nothing else after listening to my discussion with Lara, go get your water tested.
Yeah, just Google your city name, Atlanta, Georgia, water quality report, and then the year or 20. They usually come out in the summer or late summer. So if you're looking, early in the year, years live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, you're going to be looking in 2020 because that was what's available. So, so please, everybody go look up your water quality report.
Yeah, because I think when we're kind of differentiating between like ground versus surface water, it can be impacted by different types of environmental / microorganisms. And for full disclosure, and I didn't share this with Lara before we started recording, I just recently had a bunch of diagnostic testing done. I knew something was wrong. And I believe when I was probably outside the country in September, I picked up a couple parasites. And so even if you're in places where the water has been termed that it's potable, you can drink it, it's safe, sometimes it's actually not. And so the thought process is I picked it up while I was outside the United States, but different types of microorganisms can be indigenous to where you live. They can be indigenous to where you live outside the United States.
Sure.
And so being really clear that different types of water can expose us to different types of chemicals, microorganisms, contaminants, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, as a kid, I traveled internationally a lot, and people in Bangladesh or in Delhi, like they can drink the water because their gut is attuned to the microorganisms that are present there, and then we come and drink the water, and we have traveler's diarrhea is what they call it. A little unpleasant, but because it's our bodies are just not attuned to that. But to your question about like the sort of geography and the difference between groundwater and surface water, they're pretty self-explanatory in that groundwater is an underground aquifer and surface water is usually a lake or a reservoir where water is pulled from, and these are some of the things that can determine how our water is different. But, if we have an underground aquifer, provided that aquifer is deep and it is not contaminated, because those can become contaminated, that water tends to be lower in things like pesticides or industrial contaminants, because it can take so long or be impossible for chemicals to move through that sort of Earth's substrate to get that low into the geography to get into that groundwater system. Not always. Some aquifers are quite shallow. Some groundwater aquifers are contaminated, but generally speaking, they have less of those contaminants. But what they can have is more minerals. So this is where we have, for example, deposits of fluorine. Fluoride is an element. So this is where we often see high levels of fluoride in water, not because it's in the geography of the area where your aquifer is. This also might be why we have some metals. This is also why we see radioactives, arsenic, things like arsenic are coming from those mineral deposits or metal deposits. And so if you have groundwater, you maybe have a higher likelihood of having those type of contaminants. If you have surface water, that's where we have a greater likelihood of pesticides, depending on your geography, or you're in a rural or an urban area, of industrial pollutants, of microorganisms. You know, if you live in an agricultural area and there's animal husbandry, animal farming, cattle farming, or whatever, and you've got, you know, their ponds where they take their manure and they, you know, let them sit in these ponds, and then you get nitrates that seep into the groundwater. So there's this is why everyone's water is different, right? So there's hundreds of variables that can determine that thumbprint. So, you know, to your point earlier, with food, right? With nutrition, ask me, well, what's I know exercise or you know, I don't know you. So everybody's water is different, and everybody's water treatment is different. It has to match. So whatever for you, that out and your solution, and first, you know, it's going to be unique. That's my big point there.
And what has been your experience when we're talking about biological contaminants? You know, this is actually how I probably got sick outside the United States. But what are the more common waterborne contaminants that you've, you know, seen either in reports or your experience, you know, working with your students? What are the more common things you see here in the United States?
I actually haven't seen, because we disinfect our water, and that has pros and cons, right? The pros are that we don't, I mean, I'm sure in some instances, yes, there are going to always be exceptions for people that are on wells that are not regulated by the city, especially if that well is a shallow well, or in an agricultural area. There's a higher likelihood of microbial contamination, whether that's an E. coli or something like that. Certainly we have, I think actually where this conversation is more relevant is less in city water and more in this trend that people have towards drinking what's called raw water. Yeah, your face says it all. Yeah, so there's a trend. It is a small trend, thankfully. There is some person, I don't know if he's still doing this business. The Daily Show quite a while ago did like a whole thing on it, and I was like laughing and slapping my desk. I was like, haha, I know, I read articles about that guy years ago. So he, you know, he's this, I don't know, Southern California mountain hippie guy who makes these really expensive glass jugs that have sacred geometry emblazoned on them. Like, it's very woo-woo. And he has what he calls raw water. It is unfiltered, untreated water. And he sells it for like $26 a gallon or something. Wow. Absolutely astronomical, like laughable. I mean, I pay 29 cents a gallon for filtered water at the grocery store. So like, it's revolting consumerism is what it is. But there is a trend for people who really want to drink what they call spring water, and they just assume because it's coming from a natural spring that it's like pure and pristine, and that is just not the case. And so if you have, whether it's a beaver dam or a hunting range or wildlife that crosses anywhere upstream at any point, and they have waste in the water or whatever, you have no guarantee that there is not teeming with bacteria that can make people sick. And so that trend for people to drink untreated spring water, that's if the spring is monitored regularly and is consistently shown to not have any microbial contamination, little bit more comfortable with that. But thankfully this is a small trend, but I cringe. I make the face that you made when you say raw water, and I'm like, no.
Yeah,
No.
no, thank you. What's interesting is that I've had quite a few women that have come up positive for Giardia on
Yeah.
stool testing. And so I've had to ask, do you have a well? And almost always they do. And so if you have a well, don't panic, get your water tested, really
Yeah.
reasonable. The raw water concept,
Is
although
just
I
cringe.
respect the creativity, but
No, I don't
hard
even
pass.
respect that
No,
creativity. Because
no, I'm
that is,
being nice.
yeah.
It's interesting. We were just we went away for the holidays and we were hiking in this park, and our wonderful guide was explaining that certain animals will defecate, urinate in certain springs. And so he's explaining, like, don't ever drink the water while you're in this big national park. And, you know, none of us had any desire to do this, but he was saying occasionally I get people who are thirsty by the time they get to this point. And I always remind them, you're like one step away from taper urine or taper poo or whatever other animal has defecated or urinated in the water
Right.
supply. I'm like, yeah, I think that's a hard pass.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, you know, and anybody who's an outdoor enthusiast, a camper, backpacker, like we all know you can go to REI and get your water, you know, whether it's an iodine treatment or a steri pen, there's sterilization pens, there's life straw, there's all kinds of tools that people can use to make that water safer to drink. But those type of treatments are typically only targeting those Giardia or Cryptosporidium or something like that, those microorganisms. They're not looking at whether or not there's industrial chemicals in there, because, you know, again, I think, look, we have contaminants, chemicals like PFAS, compounds that have been measured in snowfall in the Arctic, in polar bears in the Arctic, not because there's any manufacturing, but because these molecules, particularly these persistent ones that don't break down, they travel in the air. They travel in the air streams, they travel in precipitation, and so they're everywhere. And so if those molecules can get all the way up to the Arctic, who says that they can't get up to the top of the mountain where your snow melt is, you're feeding your spring, you know, water. So I think that unfortunately we're past the point in time when we can make the assumption that any of our waterways in the United States are not contaminated. And that's a terrible thing to tie back to our opening conversation of Rachel Carson. Like, we've just not been good stewards.
We have not,
despite having the information, we have not been good stewards. And by we, I would like to point out, it is not consumers that have not been good stewards. It is industry and government that have not been good stewards. So I think in the conversation, whether it's around environmental chemicals or climate change or pollution, there is an intentional orchestrated strategy that industries use to push the blame onto the consumer and say it's your fault. And this is where those like no drinking straw movements, like the plastics industry is like, yeah, great, everybody go freak out about the drinking straw that has to get yanked from the nose of the sea turtle, and that pulls at our heartstrings. And so as a consumer, I'm going to say, no thanks, I don't need a straw, feel good about myself, and then continue to ignore the massive amounts of pollution that's being put out by these, you know, whether it's a Pepsi or Coca-Cola with their bottling plants and billions and billions of plastic bottles. So like, it is an intentional campaign to push the responsibility onto the consumer. And I think that that's part of why we as industry and government have not been good stewards. And yeah.
Have you watched the documentary Seaspiracy?
I did not watch that. I did not watch that one.
Well, so it starts off with the premise of, you know, you're diving down the rabbit hole of thinking the problem is about one thing, and it turns into much, much more. It was actually like being an animal advocate, and I eat animals, let me be clear. I'm an animal eater and love animals just the same, but it was a really fascinating foray into really looking at what's driving the plastics that are found in the ocean and how that impacts, you know, sea life. And so if anyone's interested, I tend to nerd out on documentaries when I travel. I try to find balanced ones, maybe clear about that. But along the same lines of, we have not been good stewards. We, as in government and industry, have not really been looking out for consumers, animal life, etc. But let's pivot a little bit and talk about one of my least favorite chemicals, which is chlorine.
Yeah.
We relocated to a new part of our state in June. And almost instantly, there was a very, very strong smell of chlorine when I turned on the faucet. And so my husband, who tolerates a lot of my idiosyncrasies about these things, we had water delivery the entire time we lived in this very small condo while we were still waiting for our house to be finished. And every time we turned on it was such a strong smell of chlorine. And the water didn't even, when you would boil water, it just never looked the same. And so I just kept saying to my kids, just use the stuff that, I mean, not that that's not even necessarily a sustainable thing to have water delivered, but the water was such a strong thing. So really thinking about why chlorine is added to the water supply, what it does, how it impacts our gut microbiome, how it impacts this water vapor that we're breathing in. So we don't even think about it. If it's not a particularly strong smell, but yet we are literally bathing in these chlorinated water. And I think it's helpful for listeners to really understand, with good intention, I think these things were added, but we come to find out they're not particularly healthy or beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a yes and, right? So, the reason why I said in the beginning when you asked about, microorganisms and bacteria, is that it's because we disinfect, and chlorine is the primary disinfectant that we use in our water systems here. And, the World Health Organization says that they hail water fluoridation as one of the greatest advancements in public health. And in a lot of ways it was, right? Like we wiped out typhoid, dysentery, cholera, like all of these really terrible communicable diseases just by chlorinating the water. And there's a price for that, right? Like nothing comes for free, especially if these things are not thought out well, I should say it that way. And so, water chlorination, I think, or I should say it this way, disinfection of water, I think, is important. How we disinfect that water matters. And this is one of those things where there is while there's an upside, there is also a downside. And the downside is that we have chlorine in our water distribution system. And so, chlorine is there to kill microorganisms. That is its job. It's added at the water utility, and sometimes there's substations along the way where it's added. How close you are in proximity to your water treatment facility or those substations, if they're added there, can influence whether or not your water smells like chlorine. I actually have pretty high levels of chlorine in my house. I have some of the worst water. I can happily talk about that if that's of interest, but it was quite a shock. Anyway, so where you live is, if you live closer to that, you may have more of that chlorine. Chlorine is a volatile chemical. That's why you can smell it. I mean, not all volatile chemicals have smell, but as soon as you turn it on, it's vaporizing, right? This is why, for example, if anybody has amphibians, fish, lizards, whatever, especially fish, it is recommended that you fill a container with water and let it sit for 24 hours before putting it into the tank. Why? So those volatile chemicals can volatilize. You're not putting chlorine in the water, which can kill your fish because they're exquisitely sensitive to that. And so, if you're a fish owner, you should intuitively know that, oh, right, duh, it's volatile. And so, it's irritating for our skin, for our hair. Certainly we're breathing it in the shower because it's vaporizing and we're absorbing it. There's some estimates that 60 to 70% of the chlorine that we take in every day comes from the shower, not from what we're drinking, because our full body, it's hot, our pores open up, absorption increases, we're inhaling it because it's turning to steam. So, there's some downsides. The upshot, and there's very few when it comes to water filtration, chlorine's one of the easiest chemicals to remove. It's super easy. You just get an activated carbon filter. It's one of the few things that's super easy to get rid of consistently. Where things get a little bit more challenging is when cities add ammonia. So chlorine plus ammonia converts to chloramine. And the reason why cities and this is actually an intentional move that cities across the United States are switching from chlorine to chloramine. because chlorine is super volatile and it smells, has a strong smell. Chloramine doesn't. Also, because chlorine is so volatile, it tends to weaken by the time it gets to the end of the distribution system, right? So as I was saying, it's more concentrated at the front end, and on the far end of the distribution system, it kind of peters out in its efficacy. So chloramine is far more stable as a disinfectant. So it stays in the distribution system more evenly for much longer than chlorine. An easy way to tell whether or not you have chlorine or chloramine is, one, to look on your water quality report, because it will tell you the disinfectant. Does they use chlorine or chlorine and ammonia, sometimes written as chloramine. And the other way that you can tell is to fill your bathtub with water. Chlorine is blue, chloramine is green.
Oh.
So when I lived in Oregon, they used chloramine. And so you could tell when you filled up the water with bath, it had like a really faint green hue. In New Mexico, in Albuquerque, it's chlorine. And so I can fill up my bathtub and I'm like, blue, it's chlorine. I mean, like, so anyway, so carbon is the easiest way to get rid of chlorine. Chloramine's much harder to get rid of. So that's the downside. Like, it stays in the distribution system longer, has better efficacy in terms of being a disinfectant, doesn't have a noticeable smell, but it's much harder to get rid of. So an activated carbon filter, not going to touch it. You need catalytic carbon or some other type of filter media to remove that. This is just a simple example that, like, what's in your water determines which direction you go in terms of filtration. So if you walk into Target or Home Depot and you just pull a Brita off the shelf, well, that's just activated carbon. That might reduce some lead and might get rid of some other contaminants, but it's not going to touch your water if it's got chloramine in it.
That's really interesting. And what are your thoughts on fluoride? I regularly get into a polite discussion with the dentist every time my children go in or my husband and I go in, and I just say, we're just going to have to agree to disagree.
Yeah.
But I know.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on fluoride. So first
I got
of
a lot of
all,
questions about fluoride. So this is
yeah.
perfect.
So, I mean, look, fluoride, there's plenty of evidence that shows absolutely without question that topical application of fluoride has shown benefit. There are still risks, but it has shown benefit. And so it's up to the individual to weigh the risks and the benefits of utilizing a topical application. I will come back to alternatives to fluoride for topical dental use in a second. But as it pertains to ingesting fluoride, there is no real evidence to support that ingested fluoride has a meaningful effect on dental caries or cavities. Ingested fluoride is a neurotoxin. Mm-hmm. And there's plenty of evidence that demonstrates that. And so, there's a really wonderful book called The Fluoride Deception. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head, but The Fluoride Deception is an excellent, it reads like a crime novel. I'm talking the Manhattan Project, atomic bombs, the largest steel manufacturers in the United States, Alcoa, like these large kings of industry that ultimately turned fluoride into something that was recognized as a hazardous waste, into something that, like, it was a PR campaign to basically turn fluoridated drinking water into like this amazing, feat of public health. And this book is, I mean, like I said, it reads like a crime novel. It's incredibly well cited and documented. And for people who want to understand the history of fluoride and why it's there and why the American Dental Association is so on board still after all of these decades, go read that book. So I don't think water fluoridation, whether it's done intentionally or whether there are natural deposits of fluoride or fluorine, like, again, if you have groundwater and there's fluorine in the geography, you're going to have fluoride. It will actually tell you on your water quality report, added or deposit erosion of natural deposits. It'll tell you where the source is. either way, it shouldn't be there. Fluoride is a halogenated compound. It shares space on the periodic table of elements with chlorine and bromine and iodine. And all four of those, well, they all essentially zero in on your thyroid. And what happens is chlorine, bromine, and fluorine and compounds that are made of those, so chlorinated, brominated, or fluorinated compounds, compete with iodine for space in your thyroid. And so that's hugely problematic to know about, or it's a hugely problematic thing for us to be utilizing chlorinated, brominated, or fluorinated compounds. I just posted the other day on Instagram that New York State just banned halogenated flame retardants from use in electronics. Halogenated meaning all three. They don't care if they're chlorinated flame retardants or brominated or fluorinated. The whole class is problematic. And so in terms of fluoride ingested, to me, it's a hard no. We want to filter that out. We don't need a thyroid suppressing chemical, natural or manufactured, in our drinking water. The fluoride that's in your toothpaste, sodium fluoride, is not the same compound that's added to municipal water, which is hydrofluorosilic acid. Hydrofluorosilic acid is a waste byproduct from the phosphate fertilizer industry. So this is where industries get together and say, hey, how can we make money off of this thing that we used to have to pay to get rid of, and now we can make money out of it. So that's my hot take on that. Going back to the thumbtack that I had put about alternatives, at least when it comes to oral care and toothpaste, is we do have an alternative. So I said that topical application of fluoride has absolutely shown benefit for dental caries, but there are risks, and the risks are exposure to thyroid suppressing chemicals. Our gums are very absorbent. We can absorb that. Kids will swallow, etc. So what we have is an alternative called hydroxyapatite, which is a mineral. It's what our teeth are actually made out of. It's been used as an alternative to fluoride in Japan for decades, but it hasn't caught on as extensively here in the United States, partly because the American Dietetic Association still refuses to acknowledge the benefit. Because it is basically a mineral, the same mineral that our teeth are made out of, it's biocompatible and there are no negative side effects. So multiple studies have shown that hydroxyapatite is just as, if not more effective than fluoride at preventing cavities and remineralizing your teeth with no side effects. So if people are like, just go use hydroxyapatite based toothpaste, they're out there.
Well, I think it's really interesting on so many levels, because this is one of those topics that I feel there's a degree of cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
Because my dentist recommends it, therefore it's safe. And I remind people, when I did my functional nutrition training a long time ago, I learned about this dentist back in the early 1900s who really revolutionized the way that we looked at indigenous cultures and their bone structure and their teeth. And so we know there's a direct correlation with dental caries or cavities and the degree of processed foods we're consuming. So on so many levels, if you have a junk food diet, it's not going to save your teeth by using fluoride-based toothpaste. At least not from what I have looked at. And certainly it's helpful for people to understand there are alternatives to kind of the conventional mindset. And I've come to find out that most dentists, both pediatric and otherwise, this isn't the sword they want to die on. They'd rather focus on other areas. And so I feel like things are starting to come around. So I love that you kind of differentiated and shared some alternatives. And talking about other things that we get exposed to, we talked about pharmaceuticals. Obviously, we have a lot of endocrine disrupting chemicals that we get exposed to. We've got kids with precocious puberty. We have the feminization of men because they're aromatizing all their testosterone to estrogen, which is not a good thing. I also think about, we touched on the heavy metal piece, but then also thinking about one of my least favorite topics of conversation, glyphosate and exposure to Roundup, because on a lot of levels, we had Robin O'Brien on, and she was talking about, how she was trying to work with farmers to get away from using these types of chemicals, which can be so disruptive to the gut microbiome and to our health. But let's at least touch on what glyphosate does in our bodies, because I got a lot of questions about this and fluoride, people asking, I know this is a known carcinogen. I know this is used to eradicate pests and is an herbicide. How can we protect ourselves? What are some of the choices we can make so that we're protecting our families as much as we can? I mean, obviously, you would probably have to go live away on an island all by yourself, or you and your family, to get no exposure to some of these things. But I know glyphosate is one that people recognize that name. They understand the association with Monsanto, and there's genuine concerns about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think when there's evidence showing that it disrupts our gut microbiome, that it can lead to leaky gut, it basically acts like an antibiotic in our system, meaning it's killing off all of that good and bad bacteria that we have in our GI system, which in and of itself can lead to so many downstream effects. And then anything that's causing an intestinal permeability or leaky gut in and of itself can also lead to a lot of downstream effects like autoimmune conditions. What I think is really interesting, and I haven't seen actual good data on this myself, but in talking to the folks over at TapScore, which is the water testing company that I work with and that I recommend, in talking to them, they've shared that they've actually seen extremely low levels of glyphosate in the water that they've tested for, like when their customers are testing for that. And so they're like that, and maybe that changes, right? Maybe that's cyclical. Maybe that just, require a larger volume of data on their end to kind of pull that together. Certainly not all of the people who are doing testing through them are adding that because it's an add-on contaminant to test for. But my hunch is that the primary exposure is going to be through food, and for folks that are living in agricultural regions. And also I would say in urban areas near parks, there are all kinds of glyphosate derivative, under different brand names that are used in public parks. And so, I think that's going to be a more significant exposure source than what we're getting in our drinking water. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it, disassociates in water or something like that. I'm not sure. But I think that our primary exposure there is going to be coming from food and drift, or, encountering it if you're walking across the lawn, where, at the park where it was sprayed or what have you. Sometimes, and I think we don't always see this, because I pay attention, but whenever you see those little flags in the ground, most of the time there's no label. It's just like a little pink flag or a green flag. Well, that's usually they're demarcating where they're going to be applying some kind of treatment. That doesn't automatically mean it's going to be a pesticide, doesn't automatically mean it's going to be glyphosate or a derivative, but just something's happening there. And sometimes in addition to the little flags, they'll put a little sign. And I usually just take a picture of it and then I go home and I look it up, because it gives you the trademarked chemical name or product name. And then you can find out, oh, is this it's an organophosphate? Is it some other type of family of herbicides? And you can kind of look that up. I've only done that a couple of times because I've only seen those signs a couple of times. Usually it's just the flags, but that's where you pick up the phone and you get in touch with the Parks Department. I think it's appropriate for people to be squeaky wheels, and to be advocates for their community and for themselves in this way by asking and posing questions and finding out what's being used. If you live near a golf course, atrazine tends to be the herbicide that's used, not glyphosate on those kinds of that kind of landscape. But if you live near a golf course, I grew up from across the street from a golf course and used to sneak out at night and roll around on the hills in the grass. I'm sure they didn't like that. But who knows what they were using? Spraying probably at night, because it was the only time where they didn't have people on the green. So that sucks for me. And anybody else like me who went and rolled around on the grass and a golf course in the middle of the night in high school. But anyway, yeah, so my understanding is that glyphosate is not showing up in water as much as people maybe think that it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And the irony is that we lived for almost 20 years in a golf course community outside of Washington, D.C. And whenever they would spray, so they would put those little markers in, I always told them not to spray our grass, not our grass. So I was the crazy woman who would ask. And so when my kids and I would walk the dogs, if we saw the flags, I would say we have to walk. We would like sometimes walk outside the community to walk our dogs so that we would lessen the likelihood. You know, my superpower is that I have this ridiculously pungent sense of smell. I mean, it benefited me enormously being an ER nurse. I could always sniff out the diabetics amongst a myriad of other things. But it also means when people spray their yards, I smell it so much more than the average person. It actually bothers me a lot. And so my kids are always like, Mom, you're so embarrassing. But, you know, I would say, listen, if it's that strong, then it just went down, and you have to sometimes, well, now talking about, you know, surface water, pray it would rain because then it would dissipate it. But sometimes you would have days where you just knew you were walking around in a chemical fog, which is just really disgusting, and that much worse for our animals and children who are smaller humans. Now, I think I would be remiss if we didn't at least end our conversation talking about microplastics, because I think this is something that a lot of people don't fully understand. They don't understand what it represents. But to me, it's something, the more I learn, the more I can't unlearn, the more I want to change things that go on in the world to ensure that we're exposed less to these. So I would love for you to kind of touch on what these are, why we need to be concerned about them, how we can lessen our exposure. I mean, it's not possible to be completely rid of it unless you, again, live on an island in the middle of nowhere. But even I was surprised, even though like washing synthetic clothing in your washing machine can expose you to microplastics. It's like, we can't get away from it.
I mean, I think wearing like synthetic. So first of all, microfibers and microplastics are microplastics. How can I say this? Microfibers are not always microplastics, but microplastics aren't always microfibers either. So our cotton clothes and wool clothes releases microfibers too. Those ones are less concerning than the plastic ones. So when we're wearing acrylic or polyester clothes, right, which is most clothes these days, you're hard pressed to find things that are 100% cotton, right? You're paying a premium for those. Those all shed these little tiny plastic fibers, and are, depending on the size, some of them you can actually capture in. They make little bags, clothes, or, you know, and buy their, and so you can in the trash, but is these fibers that get released from our clothes, we have sort of indirect exposure to them because they will go into our wastewater. That wastewater will get treated, and that those microfibers are so microscopic that they almost never get filtered out. And so there's just microplastics in our water system. They're just there. And until from a municipality standpoint, we're able to use fine enough filtration that will remove them, meaning very good block carbon or reverse osmosis that will remove those. Most cities don't use that. Some do. Then we're just have water microplastics in our water, period. This also means that we have microplastics in our food. Why? Because we're using water in the manufacturing of our processed foods. Doesn't matter if it's a cake or a soup or a soda or if it's organic or not, unless that food producer is filtering the water well for production. There's just microplastics in everything. There's microplastics in bottled water. And so, you know, the plastic, there's two kind of layers of concern. And I think the second one is the bigger concern. And then there's a lot of like we just don't know, because we're only just starting to dig into this. There's only just been research showing that there's microplastics in in the fetal environment, and babies have microplastics while they're in exposure while in utero. So we know that we all have microplastics in us. We don't necessarily know what the implications of that are. They're probably not good. Right? Probably not good, but we don't actually know what that means because we've just discovered that they're there. So give us another couple of years, maybe a decade, and we can make associations in the data that say, hey, for people that have this amount of microplastics in their system, there's associations with these outcomes. That's basically how we're going to be able to navigate the data on that. So there's the microplastics themselves, which whether if they're fibers, they're polyesters, they're acrylic. I don't know what chemicals are used to manufacture those types of plastics. So maybe there's endocrine disruptors, maybe there's not. Certainly if there's microplastics that are coming not from our clothing, but from just the breakdown of other plastic products in commerce, then we might have plastics that have BPA or plastics that have phthalates. Those are endocrine disrupting. That's concerning. But the bigger problem, and we see this in the science around like ocean microplastics, is that these plastics become sponges for other contaminants. So other contaminants are like, hey, look at that thing. Let's go glom onto it like a life raft. And so they literally become these magnets for other contaminants in the water to attach to.
I know there were a couple like short answer questions. Women in one of my monthly groups, they wanted to know, what is your personal favorite? Just take the whole filtration piece out of it. Do you have a particular type of water bottle that you like to bring with you when you're traveling? Now, it doesn't have to be, it can be just leaving your house and going to the store. It doesn't be like you're going on an airplane and leaving the country. But what is your favorite brand of water bottle and why? Do you prefer glass? Do you like stainless steel? I figure, and they said this is your personal choice. There's no,
Yes,
what is your personal favorite?
So if I'm just driving in the car, it's usually a mason jar. There's a company I discovered many years ago, probably 9 years ago, called Eco Jars,
Okay.
ECOJARZ, and they make these stainless steel coffee cup style lids that you can screw onto a mason jar. And so it just means that, if you're driving, you're literally not spilling the contents of your entire mason jar all over your face. You just have a little sippy cup hole to drink out of. So it's a little bit more contained. So if I'm just driving around, it's that. I am a mason jar girl through and through. If I'm traveling, what I usually do is I have a big stainless steel. I don't remember even who makes it. I bought it at Whole Foods. It was pretty. I just have a big, I think it's a 32 ounce bottle. So I take that with me. Here's my hack for traveling. Obviously I love it when airports have those filtered water fountains. Those are the best, those refilling stations for bottles. They don't always. What I always do before I leave the house is I take a couple lemon slices and I put them in my empty bottle.
Smart.
It makes the water taste better, even if the water tastes a little bad. So like, I say this because, there have been times where I'm like, look, while I would love to have filtered water all the time, it's not always possible. I get very dehydrated on airplanes, so I drink a lot of water. And there have been many times where I forgot my water bottle at home. I ran out of water. They didn't have a thing. And I'll just go buy a plastic bottle. Is it ideal? No. Do I like it? No. But I also really hate being dehydrated and the consequences of that. So I would rather, what I remind people is it's what we do every day that matters, not what we do every once in a while. So I think that anything that any opportunity that we can have to kind of let people know that this is not a zero-sum game. It's not all or nothing. It's not about being 100% non-toxic. It's just about doing the best that we can. And sometimes we have to loosen our requirements when we're traveling.
Well, I love the good, better, best mentality. It's obviously something I embrace myself. What are the one or two books, if someone is just fairly new to following you and hearing this information, that you feel like are good starting points if women are interested in just the very, like dipping their toe in the pond about awareness?
Not specifically about water, but there There's a really great book called Slow Death by Rubber Duck that I think is a good soft intro into this topic. It'll probably blow people's hair back if they're new to this topic, but it's just two guys who decided to like learn about all these environmental exposures. They actually exposed themselves, locked themselves in a room, sprayed a bunch of perfume and cologne, did urine testing before and after, ate a bunch of canned food, did urine testing before and after. So it's a very accessible sort of real life dive. It's a well-cited book. It's great. It's well written. So Slow Death by Rubber Duck is probably the easiest intro. If somebody's looking for something a little bit, that book has some humor in it, but if there's something, this topic tends to be a little dry, go read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It is prose. It's heartbreaking, but it is prose. It's beautifully written. She is a wonderful, was a wonderful, wonderful writer. So she just had a very poetic way of talking about these heartbreakingly devastating topics. So, and then I have a whole collection of recommended reading on my website that people can check out. Just on, I have a page on books, specifically just on books.
I can totally nerd out on reading. So I purchased both those books, read them both. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Last question.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people that have purchased reverse osmosis systems for their homes. They know they need to add in minerals. Should they, so where is a good starting point? Because what I've come to find out is a lot of women come to me, they've already installed a reverse osmosis filtration, and then they don't realize they need to add back in some of these minerals. What is the easiest way to go around this? Because they find this is so overwhelming. They're like, I thought I was doing a good thing. Now I'm being told I need minerals again. So how do we navigate that? Again, for everyone listening, test your water to find out what you need to filter out. That's the prevailing kind of theme throughout this conversation. But for those that have reverse osmosis in their homes that need to add back in minerals, what are your general recommendations or guidance on this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, some filtration, some RO systems actually have a final stage that does this. If yours does that, great, just make sure that you replace it. You can also buy, trace minerals. There's a company called Trace Minerals. They make that. You can also do like Quinton Hypertonic. That's a little bit more expensive. So there's those kinds of mineral replacements. My hot take on those though, and this is my personal take, is that the recommended amount, like 40 drops, is way overboard, right? So we know that the amount of minerals that we get from our water is negligible. It's small. It's not important though, right? Because when we remove minerals from water, we can make what's called aggressive water, where our water is trying to seek equilibrium. RO water can be hard on your pipes. It can actually pull minerals and metals from your pipes. We don't want that. And there is some evidence that suggests that the drinking of demineralized water is not good for us, even though primary source of minerals coming from our food, right? And our mineral content in our food is decreased because of soil erosion, because of overfarming practices. So the minerals that we used to get decades ago from our foods, we're not getting them at that level from our foods anymore, which is probably why we're starting to see like mineral depletion in the population. We eat a lot of processed foods that don't have minerals, and so even though the amount that we have in our water is very, very small, it's still important. So when we have these remineralization drops and they're like, add 40 drops, the water is so minerally that I feel like people won't drink it because it tastes so bad. It tastes horrendous to me personally. And so I'm okay with just adding 1 or 2 drops because I know I don't need to have that much from my water because I know I'm getting some from other places. If that makes sense. So I feel that they overdo it with the recommendation for how many drops, probably because they're like, people will run out in 30 days and they'll need to buy another one. I don't think we need that many minerals. Now, caveat, I haven't talked to anybody who does clinical lab work, who maybe is looking at mineral content and whether or not people are doing the full 40 drop protocol that they recommend, or if they're doing a little, or if they're doing none. So I could be totally off base on that, but just as a tool to adopt the practice, because if I don't like it, I'm not going to do it. If it tastes bad, I'm not going to do it. I don't care how important it is for me. I'm just can't do it.
Compliance is huge.
Yeah,
Like
I just won't do it.
My patients, if I can't get you to do X, Y, or Z, then we have to do a workaround. And so,
Yeah.
much
And
to your point,
and I know most people don't, they're just like, I don't know, somebody told me to do it, so I'm going to do it. I know why it's important, and I still won't do it if it tastes bad.
Right.
So
Which
this
makes
is where,
sense.
yeah, so this is where I'm like, look, if you want to do a drop, great, do a drop, and do a drop all day in the water that you drink all day. You don't have to take an 8-ounce glass with 40 drops of trace minerals that it just tastes like you're licking a metal pole. It's not good.
Doesn't sound very satisfactory.
It's not, it's yucky. I mean, I think of, and this goes to our seafood conversation. I love oysters. Oysters are very mineral rich. They're excellent. And they have that taste. They have that like slightly metallic, briny taste because they're so rich in minerals. And so I go out of my way to eat oysters. They're rich in B12, they're high in zinc. And so I go out of my way to eat oysters. And I know not everybody has access or even likes oysters, as a counter to like having to do mineral drops sometimes.
It's all about balance, right?
Yeah, it's all about balance.
Well, Lara, as always, it is such a pleasure to connect with you. Let listeners how to locate you, your amazing courses, your list of book recommendations, how to connect with you outside of the podcast. Obviously, we'll reference all of your connecting points. What's the easiest way to reach out to you?
Yeah, certainly on Instagram. I'm there over at Environmental Toxins Nerd. I hope everyone can appreciate how accurate my IG handle is. So I'm on Instagram at Environmental Toxins Nerd, and then people can just come check out my website, which is just my name, laraadler.com. I have a bunch of health professional courses that people can check out if they're interested in diving in. And I have a whole shop section if people are looking for recommendations, whether it's for reading materials or mattresses or cookware or skincare products or household cleaners. I've kind of curated a list of some of my favorite products. So if people want to kind of cut to the front of the line and just tell me what to do and what to get, that's why I created those lists.
Such an invaluable resource. Thank you again for your time. Glad you got settled in your new home, and we'll connect again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back.
Hey, if you like this video, you guys are going to love this video, and I'll see you there.
We make almost all of our fat cells during childhood and puberty. And then once we finish puberty, we're done. That number of fat cells, in most people, there are some people who are an exception to this, and that's about 15% of people who are in the obese category. But most people reach a limit, and that's their fat cell number essentially for adulthood.